Welcome to today's Tuesday talk by the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam. I'm very happy to welcome Stephan, who has been a senior fellow at the IASS for the past year. He is still actually an adjunct professor of sociology at the University of Vienna, and his main research areas are sociological transformation, post-growth and sustainable developments, and sociological theory of qualitative methods. Today, he will be presenting the findings of his fellowship and work he has been doing on questions of transdisciplinary and transformative theories and methods. His presentation, as you can see, is titled Transdisciplinary Sustainability Research, Sociological Reflection, Procedural Perspectives, and Professional Cooperation. And as usual, we will record this session. And now, without wasting any more time, Stephan, please start. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Arin, for this kind introduction. Thank you, Angela, for having sent the paper around last week. I know all of us typically have no time, do not really have time to read additional papers, but maybe some of you could manage to have a look at it. And for all the others, I tried to give just a few insights into, let's say, I hope so, main points of the paper, or what I think about transdisciplinary sustainability research in methodological terms. So what I want to do today is to say a few words about aim and status of the paper, then a bit about sustainable development. After that, I come to the point that I observe as an inconsistency in the transdisciplinary research debate. Then I'll introduce my procedural approach, and finally I will have a few words about collaboration and professionalization. So I announced 10 to 15 minutes. Probably it takes me longer. I couldn't manage to put all the points, the reduced points to 10 minutes. So however, let's start. Okay, as Achim managed, I'm a fellow for several times here, for several months here. And actually, I applied in 2018 when the call for fellows was about methodology and methods in transdisciplinary research. So this is my main subject of the fellowship, actually. Then I started only in October 2019. Last year, I had a 6-month stay at the University of Erfurt. So I'm still here, or I'm here again now for my last 3 months from January to March, or so there are a few weeks left now. And I hope to rework the paper in the next few weeks. So this was a great chance for me and a great opportunity to be part of the IASS for several months and nearly a year now, because I used to be affiliated to Sociological Institute so far, as you can see in the paper, obviously. So, of course, I like sociology, but I do not only like sociology and only sociologists, but of course, the most exciting and inspiring encounters are always with different and new kinds of thinking thinking in research. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be here and have this had the chance to learn about transdisciplinary methodology. So what did I do apart from this in terms of publication? This is these 2 publications I've noticed here. So the first one is an article that, okay, it should have been published in, I don't know, December or so, but it's not really a fast-track publication process. So, but it should finally appear these days. So the proofs are there, and we will see. And this is basically about interdisciplinary communication between social and natural sciences. And the next one is I edited a book about the work of Richard Sennett. And I started this edition in early 2019, or maybe with first ideas at the end of 2018 or so. That means long before I started the fellowship. And but you know, one need to find the right authors, and the authors need to write their articles. And so most of the time, at least half of the time of the work, I had to put in this book took place during my stay at the IASS. And this was very useful, by the way, because useful for the final paper, because one of the main subjects and ideas of Sennett revolve around cooperation, which is an important part in the paper. So let's turn to the paper finally. Okay, this is the first point of possible discussion today, maybe. And the question is, what does transdisciplinary research, or what is its reference in terms of the subject matter and task? And as you know, in the papers by the IASS, this is typically so-called wicked problems. But I chose to use a specific perspective on sustainability. That is what's typically called a procedural conception of sustainability. And this is not a contradiction to wicked problems. It's just another perspective which is more, which not that much ask about the structure of the problem, but much more about how to handle it. So sustainable development then is conceptualized as a learning process. So we have this term of a procedural conception also. And therefore, I introduce a corresponding procedural conception of transdisciplinary research. So the link is basically the following. Sustainable development is understood as a learning process. Procedures organize learning processes, and therefore we can analyze such learning processes as procedures with a procedural conception of transdisciplinary research. Okay, so this is basically the idea. And another characteristic of sustainable development is typically the integration of social and environmental issues. And therefore, there's a requirement, of course, to integrate the different actors representing or advocating social and environmental issues. And this is my link to cooperation, which is a main part in this paper and in this presentation. So I'll start with cooperation on the next slides, and after that I'll come to the procedural conception. So, but I don't start with cooperation immediately, but start with what I observe as an inconsistency in the transdisciplinary research conceptual debates. And this inconsistency is about symmetry or asymmetry between science and practice. So what I found is two conflicting claims in the debates. On the one hand, transdisciplinary research is always introduced and determined as a specific kind of scientific research. On the other hand, it is determined as something new or something third in between science and practice. So the inconsistency then means that it is not really clear in the debate, for me, how these two determinations of TD research fit together. So how can it be a scientific activity and at the same time something beyond science? Okay. So I give you this example here from the paper by Lang et al. So on the one, or they start to introduce to say there is no primacy of science and there is no primacy of practice. It's about the relationship. And then they give a specific definition of transdisciplinarity. So let me quote this. Transdisciplinarity is a reflexive, integrative, method-driven scientific principle aiming at the solution or transition of societal problems and concurrently of related scientific problems by differentiating and integrating knowledge from various scientific and societal bodies of knowledge. So it's a bit much for the moment, but the main part is what I put in italics. This is scientific principle. And the question was about the relationship between science and practice. And the offer here is scientific principle can provide this, this integration. So the question then is, how can a scientific principle, how can the sciences provide the integration of science and practice without the primacy of science? So this kind of integration is only possible from a scientific perspective. And therefore my conclusion is that transdisciplinary research, or the debate about transdisciplinary research, is a scientific self-reflection about the meaning and role of scientists in collaborative activities with non-academics. So that is what I also call a scientific bias in the paper. It's a scientific perspective in spite of the claims for something beyond science. Or in other words, it's an integration of science and practice from scientists for scientists. So, okay, however, this is not meant as a criticism here, but the idea is just to accept this kind of scientific bias. In the paper, I also write about the legitimate bias. So there is a primacy of science regarding transdisciplinarity as a conceptual debate. Okay, so scientists are interested in conceptual debates, and therefore this is a scientific debate, and that's the scientific bias. Okay, so but what about the equality of the partners then? What I have observed in the conceptual articles is that the authors typically tend to declare the partners to researchers too. So this implicates the idea that the non-academic partners would be most appreciated and acknowledged as equals when they are addressed as being the same as we are, that is, as researchers. And the crucial question then is this true? So you're probably not surprised that I doubt it. And okay, so to put it in other words, is a politician really more respected when we call him or her a researcher in our transdisciplinary research team and our transdisciplinary research process? So these are quotations from the papers. Yeah? The papers talk about research teams and research processes of all partners. So is a politician really more respected when we call him or her a researcher in such a research team? Or is he or she more appreciated when we address him or her as someone different, someone with competencies we don't have, someone who is good in decision making and political mobilizing? If we take this example of a politician, we could also take artists or businessmen, businesswomen, and so on. Okay, so to keep it short, the collaborators, I think, are most acknowledged when their different expertises are appreciated in a collaborative team, not a research team, which implicates that knowing the own role and position and its limits is a precondition of good cooperation. Just a moment. Okay, good. To talk about a research process is interesting for scientists, but we shouldn't expect the same interest for all other partners too. This is in line with theories of societal differentiation. And as you know, these theories of societal differentiation are not really appreciated typically in transdisciplinary research debate. But I think we should take social differentiation as an advantage and as something valuable, not as something we desperately need to overcome. So to put it in a slogan, don't be afraid of differentiation. Okay, sometimes we need slogans. My grandma always said, exaggeration makes things clear. Übertreibung schafft Klarheit. So let me turn to the procedural approach now. If we understand the cooperation in transdisciplinary research that way, that is from a perspective of differentiation, how can we conceptualize this, and how can we combine this with the idea of sustainable development as a learning process? As I said before, procedures organize learning processes, and these learning processes also need to integrate social and environmental issues and the different societal actors who represent and advocate these different issues. I therefore suggest a procedural conception of transdisciplinary research. Such a conception can draw on the procedural theories by Luhmann, Habermas, and Latour. All of them understand procedures as learning processes, although they have very different ideas of what learning means actually. In combination of these three approaches or theories, in combination, this enables to see some basic tasks and requirements each and every procedure as a procedure needs to include and to deal with. And this will be useful for our general conception of procedures. So what are these basic tasks and requirements? I switch to the next slide so you can follow this not really elaborated graph, but okay, I hope it makes things clear. So first of all, procedures need to start with a situation of uncertainty or indeterminacy. Let's think about a legal dispute, a set of candidates in a political election, or a new problem in the sciences, and of course each kind of crisis. Then we need some formal guidance for tests and selection processes. But this guidance must not determine the outcome. So what does it mean? Take the example of the election. You have a set of candidates and you need several steps and selections to find the right candidate. But this procedure itself doesn't determine the outcome in terms of the candidate. Okay, so it's just a formal guidance there. The next step, there needs to be a result. Procedures always have to produce a result. That's the third part. Nevertheless, and as a final step, these results need to be open to reflection and potentially to become a starting point for further procedures. So think of the election example again. The candidates are selected for a limited time only and need to be re-elected or unelected then. Or think in terms of scientific studies. We have a study and we have a result, and typically the results produce new questions. So, and this is the idea of reflecting learning. We start the procedure again, the next study, but on a higher level, so to speak, okay? Therefore, this part of documentation is important. Otherwise, we would start the same study again and again. Okay, so let's apply these procedural ideas to transdisciplinary research. First of all, we need to re-articulate the problem of cooperation between science and practice in terms of the procedural model. So this was our question in the beginning. about the cooperation between science and practice. So the question then is, do all the different collaborators follow their own procedures, or do all of them follow a joint procedure beyond their own field of practice, revolving around a raised issue? And the answer, at least from my conceptual perspective, is both is true in combination. So if we think about the sciences, for example, the scientists as collaborators are still scientists and follow the joint procedure on their own scientific path. I give you the example by Latour to maybe make it better comprehensible for this situation. Okay, Latour's metaphor, so to speak, is a construction site. This is in his book about the Parliament of Things. I think it's how to bring the sciences into democracy, or democracy into sciences is the English title. I'm not sure at the moment. So, but in this book, he debates his whole procedural model along a construction site metaphor, so to speak. So all the trades involved contribute to the construction of a building, whatever building, but they do so through their particular competencies. That means all follow a joint procedure in a joint construction project, but all of them do it their way, the way of their trades and competencies. This is the picture, the metaphor. A more applied and illustrating example by Latour for this procedural conception is the crisis of the BSE, or mad cow disease, epidemic in Europe in the 1990s. This issue mobilized several actors, politicians, bureaucrats on several levels, EU, national, local, regional, veterinarians, civil society activists, consumers, of course, meat industry, cattle raisers, and so on. And all of them had to find solutions for their specific problems, the consumer problems, the cattle raiser problems, the legal problems, and so on. All of them had to find solutions for their specific problems, and all of them at the same time changed the whole European network of keeping cattle for human food. So from a procedural perspective, there was a joint procedure and at the same time several procedures for all the participants. To sum up, the conceptual idea here is all collaborators in transdisciplinary research follow the same procedural rules in principle, but in the specific way or program of their practical field. So why should we do this, or why should we use it? What are the conceptual gains for it? First of all, the procedural conception, I think, is not about the substitution of established conceptions, but it can provide social theory-based ground for the transdisciplinary conceptions debates, which is often asked for in the articles I read. So the general model of procedures can perfectly include the phase models of idealized transdisciplinary research processes. These are the models I debated in the paper. And it promises more consistency regarding the inconsistencies I introduced before. Secondly, the procedural conception can also provide formal criteria for evaluation. So I just give you this example. Each step in the general model. So this is the general model here. Each step in the general model of procedures asks for particular tasks and requirements which need to be accomplished. So for instance, in the first step, we can ask, is this an open procedure? Or how can the agenda be open to open to search for new perspectives, inputs, and actions. So, and similar to all of these steps, we can derive formal questions and criteria. Okay, so yeah, I come to my end. Here are my conclusions in terms of, let me say, short statements or theses. First of all, we should understand transdisciplinary research as a specific kind of applied sciences. Then it is always clear that it is about science and not about something beyond science. But it is a particular kind of applied science, namely the collaboration of scientists with non-academics. That is, the scientists contribute their particular expertise, just as all the other collaborators contribute their particular expertises too. Political, legal, economic, and so on. Secondly, the conceptual transdisciplinary research debate then is a scientific self-reflection about the, I can't read it, what I wrote, and role of the meaning and role of scientists in collaborative activities with non-academics. So as I said, it's an integration of science and practice from scientists for scientists. Yes? This is the conceptual debate. Thirdly, what we can learn about cooperation is that good cooperation depends on differences, on heterogeneity. Instead of declaring all collaborators to researchers, good cooperation needs the different competencies of the collaborators. Even in a collaborative project, they keep their distance to each other in terms of their professional roles and competencies. Only on that basis, I think, a professionalization of this work is possible. Main characteristics of professionality are, for example, the adaptation of general knowledge to specific cases, a set of professional standards, and the assurance of their quality, for instance, through specific training. Also, chances for supervision-like activities as provided through accompanying research or project boards could be a good idea. Okay, this is only an outlook from me. And if the analysis is on the whole plausible, then the professionalization of transdisciplinary research will be a promising task for the next years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephan, for the presentation. I would then like immediately go to the discussion. If you would have a question, comment, or anything, please either raise your hand or put something into the chat like a question or so on, in case I do not see you immediately. Is there anyone who would like to start? Otherwise, I would have a question. Steve, please.
Thank you for your presentation very much. And I apologize for not replying to your email. I got buried in my Outlook, so I wasn't ignoring that. I have a lot of questions, but maybe one that I'll start with. I'm very, very curious this idea, the procedural approach. It connects very much to John Robinson's work on procedural sustainability, and there's obviously a lot of focus on the openness and so on. And there's value in that in itself, it seems. But I'm curious if you ran across thoughts, either in your research or had your own thoughts on, is there a linkage between this procedural approach and then actually generating better sustainable outcomes, or a more substantial contribution to sustainable transition or sustainable development? And this is one of the things I'm often curious about, because it's a kind of a fundamental assumption within a lot of the transformative transdisciplinary research that this way of working and way of doing research will lead to more sustainable outcomes. But I'm curious if you had thoughts on that, or is it more about that this very act of doing this work in an open and collaborative way is inherently a more sustainable way of doing research and kind of models a different way of doing things. So I'm curious in your thoughts on that.
I tried to get, finally I managed. Okay, now I can see all of you better. So, okay, thank you, Steve, for this comments. I was a little bit busy with my technological things, but I understand your point basically as if this procedural conception, I think you had this kind of articulation to say, are there more substantial results in sustainability out of this procedural conception? And this is problematic, of course, because it's a procedural conception and not a substantial conception. So if you ask about more substantial results, you need substantial criteria. And the idea of a learning process and the procedural conception is that the idea of what sustainability finally means is something we learn step by step. And then, of course, it's it's not easy to make progress or to measure the progress if we say we have no more or less absolute criteria. So we could measure the results. But this is part of actually. Therefore, I could say no. The short answer is no, but the maybe more helpful answer is yes, but the progress we can make in substantial terms depends on what the participants in this learning process define step by step, more and more, better and better as sustainability. So, okay, maybe that. I hope this.
Yeah, great, thank you.
I see Armin and then Diana. Armin, please.
Yeah, thanks, Stephan, for your presentation. Well, for me, one of the key pillars of transdisciplinarity, transdisciplinary research, is stakeholder-based science. So, okay, what are we talking about? We are talking about science. So what is science? Science is about finding out what's going on in nature, in society, in history, whatever. Okay, you can do that together with stakeholders. What are stakeholders? Well, stakeholders are the people who basically your research is addressed to. So somehow they should care about finding out what's going on. And now for 15 years, I've been doing stakeholder-based science, and I try together with stakeholders to find out what's going on. We found out quite something. So basically, that's a straightforward concept. It's straightforward, it's easy, it's doable, we can do it. A lot of people at IASS are doing it. Where's the issue?
Okay, I think the question is not quite clear to me. So what exactly is the question now?
Well, if I frame and phrase it like that, we basically don't have a procedural issue. We don't have a problem to solve. We are just doing our craftsmanship. We are doing stakeholder-based science by together, jointly with stakeholders, trying to find out what's going on in specific fields, of course. That could be the energy system, it could be mobility, it could be finance, it could be plastics, it could be biodiversity. There's a lot of fields where we can do that, and we are doing it. So the question is, where is the problem that needs to be solved?
The problem is always part of the definition of those who are participating in this process. So no one would participate in this process if there would be no issue, no problem. So therefore, the question is not quite clear to me. There's always a problem, but these problems are always defined from different perspectives. So the problem that the scientists have is to get more knowledge. The problem the the politicians have is to how can we mobilize the people and to make good decisions. And the problem for the businessman and businesswoman is, and okay, how can we earn some money with it, and so on. Okay, so there are different perspectives on the problem, and this is always part of the process to deal with this and to negotiate.
Well, if I may just hook in there, well, of course, there should be an issue of shared or joint interest, because otherwise, why would you cooperate? So it might be the case that you want to understand how to avoid plastic garbage. And of course, you have a legal perspective, you have a political perspective, you have a sustainability perspective, ecological perspective, business perspective, what have you. So there is something that you're curious about. How can we do it? How can we accomplish it? Yes. And of course, the trick is that you engage people from the various fields into a joint process. Yes, because otherwise it would not make sense to join forces. Yes. And of course, people deliver their competence, whether it's business or legal or political or natural science, whatever, into the group in order to find out what they're after, how to do better, whatever, avoiding plastic, for example. Yes, of course, that's the trick. That's the issue. Now the question is, you can then, of course, ask questions like, are they all becoming scientists? Ooh, you can ask the question. I wouldn't ask this question. I would ask, what are they up to? They are up to joining forces for finding out something. Yes, of course. That's the whole point of it. And we can describe that. We can describe the concept. We can describe the practice. We can describe the experience. And the IASS has done a lot of these things in the past 10 years. We can basically look into these as case studies, how to do it. And of course, then the question is, how do you evaluate it? Well, the question is, have they found out something? And of course, they always find out something, sometimes more, sometimes less. Yes, well, that's the usual thing. And what I wanted to hint at is that for me, I have a pretty straightforward definition of what is transdisciplinarity. It's stakeholder-based science and actually interdisciplinarity combined. And that's it. And we practice that at IASS for 10 years now.
Okay, so you can write a very short paper about it with a very short definition, and okay, you can do it. So I don't know what I can say about it. I just relate to the conceptual debates that I find in the papers, and there are much more than, okay, there's some interdisciplinarity and some practice and some science, and we put it together, and that's all. So there are a lot of papers about it, and there's a big discussion, and I try to relate to it and to give a reinterpretation and let's say the missed in the papers missed social theory ground. I try to contribute a bit of it. So that's my part, so to speak. Okay.
Thanks. And Diana, you wanted to put a comment as well?
Yes, thanks. Thanks for the presentation, Stephan. To be honest, I'm not really into this whole theoretical background, and I'm also a little bit confused, to be honest. But I have more like a practical question. I'm not sure if you can answer it, but it's more like about this transdisciplinary science. And I wonder if it's really the better way of doing science, if we know that people are kind of affected by the research or by the results of the research, if this is something we can kind of conclude, or if there's some evidence. And also, does it really lead, like this whole transdisciplinary research, does it lead to more sustainable outcomes? So can we say something about it, that the outcomes we receive from this research are also like better in terms of what we really will receive otherwise? Maybe some thoughts from your side would be very helpful.
Yeah, I think it's a very similar question to what Steve asks. is there a better output with this conception than with other conceptions in practical terms?
Not like, yeah, I understood Steve, he asked really conceptually, so I don't really know what this really means in these terms, but yeah, if it is, sorry for that, but yeah, really in practical term, like, do we have some evidence, like people really studying on the ground, like, you know, the results, the outcomes we see?
Yeah, I don't know. We need to test it, so to speak. So you can say maybe you use the conception by Lang et al. or Jan et al. and all the phase models that are also picked up by Lorenz et al. So you maybe you use these conceptions, and maybe it's helpful. And I could say from my understanding or from my conceptual work, I can display these conceptions in my conception as well, or in this basic social theory ideas for maybe a more consistent conception. And if this is helpful in practice, let me ask you another question. How do you measure if there is more sustainable output or not? So this is an interesting question. So you ask, is there more sustainability output or less? And how would you measure this? I can only say from my conception, we will see during the learning process. But it's good to have a good learning process and a good idea of how to manage the learning process, and then we probably get better results than with a bad with a bad learning process, or with some ideas without learning processes. Okay, maybe that's the point. I try to give ideas how to manage a good learning process, or to provide criteria what is a good learning process to come to good results. If this works, I don't know.
And learning would be then that people generate knowledge, that they take ownership of the research themselves. I mean, I know there are some points that transdisciplinary research always kind of claims to aim for, right, and to generate. And is this what you mean, like with learning, or what are kind of key components regarding that, maybe?
Yeah. So learning is a broad conception. In the sciences, we typically think about it in terms of knowledge and in terms of scientific learning. So from a pragmatist perspective, we would say all the people are interested in problem solving, but the kind of problem is always defined depending on the perspective or the, let's say, affiliation, or the where do you come from? How do you look at this problem? So the problem for the scientist is a problem of knowledge. How can we better understand this whole procedure, or this issue? But for the maybe you can check it from your practical experience. Are the businessmen and women in such projects, or the artists, or the politicians, are these interested in the question you are interested in, the terms of, oh, we need a better understanding of all this? Or are they just interested in, okay, we need to come to solve this problem in, let's say, political terms. We need a better decision. We need a better regulation. So these are the issues for the politician. So all of them are interested in problem solving. But what is the problem? It's for the scientist, the problem is another thing than for the politician. So that's the point. And learning, of course, you can learn as a politician and you can learn as a scientist. So so the learning process is, so to speak, for all of them. But all of them have their specific perspective on these learning processes. Okay.
Thanks. Steve had a follow-up question, but if somebody who has not yet posed a question or comment, the person would take precedence. Oh yeah, okay, Inge and then Steve. Thanks.
Yeah, I would try to go to be an in-between Armin and Stephan. In that way that Armin, I'm more on that pragmatic side as well, but I have grasped that some depth of what you have presented. So Armin is very much on that side. It's just stakeholder-based science and interdisciplinarity. That's it. Voila. Fait accompli. I mean, already in this wording, there's some problem. Stakeholder-based. What does that mean? Do you mean what stakeholder bring to the table and then scientists, what they cook with it? Or what do you mean with stakeholder-based? But let's set that aside. I've tried to structure the problem with this, with which you started, with this primate of science and primate of practice, in my point of view, and I have just lived through a process. Okay, I have to say that as precursor. My very fresh empirical basis is a process which I called deep transdisciplinarity, which was a co-creation process for a research proposal. Oh, research about it was that it was a research call, but it was co-created in that way that we had 50-50 civil society organizations and researchers, and I was the go-between. So I went like, explained the civil society side, who asked me, what do these researchers want? So I explained them what they want, and I explained the research side what the interest of the civil society organizations is. So, and then we knitted that together. So that was really co-creation. From that, the question of primate, for me, it is bringing different sources of knowledge to the table and having scientific methods in integrating them or combining them or meta-analyzing them to get to new knowledge. So that is scientific. And I would also say scientific methods to structure the process. And so in that way, it is a primate for the methods of doing something with the knowledge. But it is originally different types of knowledge. But I even see a problem there, because what do you do with people who believe in conspiracy theories and this kind of stuff? Is that then for which there is no whatsoever? I mean, it's really absurd what they bring to the table. What do you do with that? For that, I don't have an answer, but just this pragmatic thing about the type of knowledge and scientific methods as the sign, that's the part of the scientific primate of science. But the other thing I want to say, what I've observed in the discussion, is this difference of objectives and interests. Oh no, I only heard interests, not objectives. I think that has to be differentiated, that the players might have different interests. Maybe that's to be clarified, whether they have the same overall objective as a mission, kind of. We all want to achieve sustainable development, to be questioned, but I would say that is definitely part of the process. And then the third element is what I remember very much from Ortwin, when we were, that was actually a fellow meeting during our process pre-evaluation, or the IASS approach, where Ortwin told the story that in such a co-creation collaborative process, for him the difference then, for certain parties brought knowledge to the table where you could see with a more distant scientific perspective on it that they were biased because they had a different interest. So that's another of my first point of this, what is scientific about it. That's a certain distance, a certain impartiality. So that's the third level of primate of science. But a full acceptance of the different types of knowledge brought to the table.
Okay, lot of points and questions maybe, but I agree to say, if I got you right, I would agree to say there are different biases. So there is the scientific bias I talked about, and there is a political bias by the politicians, and there's an artificial bias by the artists, and an economic bias by the economists. But if you talk about bias, this is always a negative sound. And maybe we should just accept this and say, okay, that's quite clear and expectable that the economists are not that much interested in theory and in really great knowledge and insight, but much more in how to get the business on. And so the politicians are much more interested in how to mobilize the people for a better regulation and a new decision. And so my whole point is about an acknowledgement of these. So maybe that's what you also said at the end. It's about an acknowledgement of these different kinds of, if you want, biases, or if you want to say just normality, that people from different parts of society have different ideas and different interests and also different objectives. Of course, there must be something they have that they find together as a very abstract kind of objective. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to collaborate. That's quite clear. So let's say we want to have our city more sustainable, but immediately after that, you need to start, okay, what does a more sustainable city means for the scientists? What does it mean for the politicians? What does it mean for the businesses? And so on. So you immediately have to find at least a differentiation of the objectives from these different perspectives. And then they come together and collaborate. But my whole point is not to say, okay, all the people talk about what they do together, and I want to differentiate all of this. So finally, they do something together. But my point is much more from a conceptual point of view, to say we should think in terms of collaboration of different participants, and we should accept the differences in the first place, and then come together to collaborate. And then we do not need to talk about biases also, because it's not really bias in a negative sense, but it's quite another view on the world, another view on the process, and that's great, because all of them have to contribute a specific part that the others cannot contribute. The scientists have their part, of course, but the scientists are not very good in business or in politics or in the arts also, and therefore it's good to have some artists and some businessmen and businesswomen and some lawyers and some whatever. So and that's the whole point.
I have a small question on this.
Inge, sorry, if you allow me, we are 2 minutes before the close of today. Steve had a follow-up question. Armin had a follow-up question. If perhaps Steve and Armin could do their questions in 10 seconds each, then perhaps these 2 questions can also be answered. Armin is off. Okay, that's okay. Then okay. Steve, your follow-up question, please, 10 seconds.
Okay, really quick. Yeah, definitely let's talk more about evaluation and evaluating learning. But my question is about, is there a potential, because the way I understand the challenge you're talking about is that transdisciplinarity says that different knowledges in science and everyone is equal. But I think what I'm seeing from your paper is that that's not the case, that science is primary and everything else gets integrated, which connects very much to me to the way that people look at indigenous knowledge. indigenous knowledge is great, but what we need to do is take knowledge from indigenous peoples and translate it into science, rather than actually treating those as equal forms of knowledge. So I guess my question to you is, do you see the potential for that to change, to actually for transdisciplinarity to not just be going outwards towards science, but actually transforming the scientific process, transforming scientific knowledge, the way science works and how we define science?
Okay, I would say this is always a double process. If you talk about, for instance, the indigenous knowledge, from a scientific point of view, you have two chances to deal with this. On the one hand, you can try to understand what indigenous people think from your scientific point of view. So you can think about in terms of theories, conceptions, methods, and so on, and can try to understand what is their perspective on the world. How do they explain themselves, what's going on, and so on. So this is a scientific interpretation of what is going on. And the other point is the point of collaboration. So you can also say, so whatever I think, whatever they think, let's collaborate in a project and to find solution for whatever problem. So, and we can contribute our knowledge and they can contribute their knowledge, and we need to find a way to learn together and to get through and to make something better for all of us. So this is a double process. On the one hand, I would always say I think it's kind of not what I think it's very makes very sense to become an indigenous thinker also. I think that wouldn't work. So, but we can collaborate, or we can try to understand it in our, as scientists, you can think whatever you want as people, as a person, but as a scientist, you need to stick to your theories, to your conceptions. You need to give reason for your methods and so on. And you cannot get out of this, and therefore you also have, as a scientist, only this access to indigenous knowledge, I would say. But on in terms of sustainable development and so on, and collaborative projects, then you have also the chance just to collaborate and to say, okay, this is our thinking, that is their thinking, and how can we handle together the sustainable city, for instance. Okay.
Thank you very much, Stephan. This concludes today's Tuesday talk. I thank you very much all for your contributions, in particular Stephan for the presentation. He will stay with us for a couple of more weeks, and if you would like to see again actually the draft of the paper he's going to produce, just let us know. Beyond that, I can only hope you will have a nice afternoon. At least in Potsdam, it's very sunny with nice blue skies actually, and then enjoy the day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.